domestic servers if given the opportunity, Pastor. Could have been electrical engineers, playwrights and authors, educators of the highest regard, federal judges, or astronauts. But they played the role of their time, the role that made us make it to this very day today. Now, what these black men and women found out when they were able to make it safely to the north, because that journey wasn't just a walk in the park now, but what they found out was that aside from the competition for jobs and employment, there was also competition for living space in these increasingly crowded cities. While segregation wasn't legalized in the north like it was in the south, racism and prejudice were widespread nonetheless. Now, after the United States Supreme Court declared racially based housing ordinances unconstitutional in 1917, some residential neighborhoods where blacks had started moving into, they started to enact these covenants requiring the white property owners to agree to not to sell to black folk. These so-called covenant acts would remain legal until the Supreme Court struck them down in 1948. But don't you leave this talk this morning thinking that these black folks, these black migrants, were greeted with open arms when they reached their destinations of these white northern and midwestern cities. No, sir. Rising rents in segregated areas, plus a resurgence of the KKK activity after 1915, worsened black and white relations all over this country. Now here's how that time was recorded. The summer of 1919 began the greatest period of interracial strife in the United States history at that time, including a disturbing wave of race riots. Now, that's how the history books record it. Let me tell you my version of it. The summer of 1919 began the greatest period of white men killing innocent black men, women, and children in the United States history at that time, including a disturbing wave of race riots with violence perpetrated from whites on blacks. Now that is hurtful and it's not good to say, but it's truth. It's the truth. The most serious outbreak of that time was the Chicago race riot of 1919. It lasted 13 days, left 38 people dead, 537 black children and women and men were injured, and there were 1,000 black families left without homes overnight. Now here's the impact of the Great Migration. As a result of the housing tensions that many of these black migrators ended up dealing with, they eventually ended up creating their own cities within some of these big cities. Okay? They fostered the growth of a new African American culture. The most prominent example of this was in Harlem in New York City. Prior to 1900, Harlem had been an all-white neighborhood in New York City. But by the 1920s, Harlem was home to some 200,000 African Americans. The black experience during the Great Migration became an important theme in the artistic movement, known first as the New Negro movement, and then known later and known today as the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance has had an enormous effect and impact on the culture, not just then, but even still today. The Great Migration also began a new era of increasing political activism among African Americans, who after being disenfranchised in the South, found a new place for themselves in public life in the cities of the North and the West. Black migration slowed considerably in the 1930s when the country sank into the Great Depression, but picked up again with the coming of the Second Great War, World War II. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the migration of blacks from the South to the North began to slow down for several reasons. By 1970, when the Great Migration ended, its demographic impact was unmistakable. Whereas in the year 1900, 90% of the black people who lived in America lived in the South. And of those black people who lived in the South, 75% of them lived on the farm or in rural areas. But by 1970, only about 48% of black Americans lived in the South, with only about 25% of them living on the farm or in the rural areas. Think about that. Half of our family left We are only representing half of the family, even today. Now, what I've just given you is just a very, very brief and basic recap of one of the greatest stories of people moving and shaping the life and identity of a country that has ever been recorded. There will be movies, there will be plays, there will be even more books. There'll be college courses taught and degrees conferred. And those things will do far more justice to the great black migration than I have in this speech. I'm not a historian. I'm an educator. And specifically, I'm an education researcher. So being from Shreveport and having received my education in these Caddo Parish schools and being a researcher, I ask a lot of questions about Caddo schools. And I've discovered that there is a migration happening now. Maybe not as the one we just discussed, but it's just as personal and just as real in the lives of many of us today. And I'm talking about the great migration of Caddo Parish public school students. And I call this the quiet migration. See, every morning of a school day, Monday through Friday, the quiet migration begins in Caddo Parish. Little boys and little girls, they wake up from the comfortable and cozy confines of their homes in Queensboro, Cooper Road, Moortown, Cedar Grove. These little boys and girls who've been recognized as capable and competent students as early as their first or second grade year in school. Those little boys and girls will hop on buses and hop in the back seats of cars and be whisked far away out of their black neighborhood and passing right by their black neighborhood schools in some cases to their designated places of learning across town and away from their neighborhood blocks. The destination that these little boys and girls arrive to is like a paradise of educational resources and highly qualified teaching personnel. These places stand as the bright and shiny schools on the hill in our city. And they are, as you have probably figured out, the magnet schools of Caddo Parish. Now, I'm not here to vilify the magnet schools. I attended magnet schools in Caddo Parish. I just believe that we should be asking better questions by now, almost 40 years since they were created. Questions like, what is the value of neighborhood schools in Caddo Parish? Specifically the black neighborhood schools. Black schools in Caddo Parish have been the most closed, shut down, right-fitted, restructured, name changed, turned from schools to labs to academies, back to schools, and various other experimented on methods. What does that look like 50 years from now? And should we wait until then to decide to ask? Well, by then, I argue it will be too late. It's too late now for some of our schools in our neighborhoods. Look at the schools that sit empty and in some cases dilapidated and fit for demolition. Lakeshore Elementary, Newton Smith, Hollywood, or George P. Hendricks, just to name a few. Now, I offer this migration analogy for two reasons. The first is that Dr. Woodson's organization says that I can. And let me read to you from the ASALH announcement of this year's theme. Quote, the theme Black Migrations equally lends itself to the exploration of racial suburbanization and inner city hyper-ghettoization. End quote. Hyper-ghettoization. Yeah, that's a sociological term from the root word ghetto. It originated in the 1500s from Venice, Italy, and was used to describe the segregated place within Venice where Jews could live and assemble. The term is one of exclusion, and as the Jews were excluded from Venetian society and its Catholic and Christian traditions, these ghettos were situated in the poorest resourced parts of the city, lived in by migrants who were newly arrived and not accepted into the mainstream society, and who had the fewest resources of anyone in the city. Now fast forward today, and we use the word ghetto to describe any place that is characterized and defined by the economically disadvantaged context of the people who inhabit it. And so since the ASALH, the premier organization dedicated to Black history, founded by the father of Black history, and the founder of Black History Month, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, on September 9th, 1915, believes that this year's chosen theme should spark such conversations and discussions within the Black community. I ask you to think with me for just 1 minute. What if for the last 30 years, the most promising and brightest students in Allendale had stayed at Booker T. Washington and not transferred to Caddo Magnet High? What would BTW be like today? What would Allendale be like today? Would it be as economically disadvantaged as it is today? Would it perhaps have more resources? How long can we allow the best and brightest students to be migrated out of our black neighborhoods only to be given exposure to a world that will force them to one day look at theirs with an unfamiliar glance? We have to be honest about the fact that magnet schools in Caddo have ripped the best and brightest, most positive peer role models and A and B students from their neighborhood schools, and at the same time placed an aura of failure around those neighborhood schools for having such a low percentage of outstanding students. See, these patterns have lasting implications that stretch far out from the schoolhouse doors. These patterns begin to shape neighborhoods and people, and ultimately become part of people's lives and known experiences. So how much longer before we start to ask some serious questions about fairness and equity and access for all of Caddo's children? 5 more years? 10 more years? Never? I don't know. But I do know this. In some of our poorest neighborhoods in this city, the same neighborhoods that we would term ghetto or hood or whatever, those neighborhoods, for those neighborhoods, the magnet system in Caddo is a tool of hyper-ghettoization. It subtly and symbolically strips those vulnerable communities of one of their most precious resources, children, like these children we've seen this morning. Children whose recognized talents and abilities to succeed academically have made them stand out. And who are those children? They are the could-have-been political representatives of that neighborhood, fighting to ensure equal justice and protection for the community. They are the could-have-been retailers, sole proprietors, and store owners, and service providers that could have led the revitalization of some of those neighborhood blocks. They are the could-have-been preachers and police officers and school teachers who as children and early adolescents were subliminally told and subconsciously reinforced by their new magnet school structure that you're different from them. You're better than them. You don't need to be around them. Now this quiet migration of these bright students that happens every school morning in Caddo is not the most significant of migrations when it comes to black students in Caddo. That title would have to go to what was the forced migration of black students into white schools and what has now known to become as the crossover. Raise your hand if you have heard of the crossover in Caddo Parish. See, this is something that's personal and local to us. Just a quick bit about the crossover for those who don't know. The Brown versus the Board of Education was a landmark United States Supreme Court decision. And it was the decision that declared that any state law that established separate public schools for black students and separate public schools for white students was totally and completely unconstitutional. Now in Shreveport, like most other southern and definitely some northern cities, the whites in power fought hard to not enact the rules of the Brown decision. In fact, white Shreveporters were so cutting edge and quite innovative in their efforts to keep white school children from learning alongside black school children, like the ones we've seen this morning. Prior to 1950, black students in Caddo Parish attended the overcrowded and deteriorating Central High School or Marlin Street Trade School. In anticipation of the Supreme Court ruling in favor of desegregation, the white administrators of Caddo Parish schools in 1948 took up the task of building what was then one of the most modern and comprehensive schools ever built in this country, the Booker Telfair Washington High School, built specifically to show that Caddo Parish needed no desegregation. Black students wouldn't even have to worry about white students wouldn't have to worry about black students coming to their schools because black students had their own very, very super cutting edge high school that they could go to. I mean, the school was so innovative with this large college-like classrooms and hallways, machine shop, home economics lab, dry cleaning operation, printing press, and Taylor Seamstress studios built right in, that it was rated by Life magazine as one of the top 15 comprehensive high schools in the country when it opened in 1950. So when the Brown decision came down 4 years later in 1954, the white administrators of Caddo Parish Public Schools thought they had pre-addressed and solved the race issue with public schools. But guess what? Even after building the state-of-the-art Booker T. Washington High School for Caddo's black students, as the years marched on, the federal government could not ignore what was going on in this segregated city of ours. The Department of Justice became less satisfied with Caddo's implementation of the Brown ruling and Caddo's non-existent attempts to create a more fair and just desegregated school system that provided all Caddo children with the same educational opportunities. So after years of lawsuits, consent decrees, and many other complicated legal maneuverings that I don't have the knowledge to discuss, Caddo Parish schools were given a deadline to completely integrate. And that forced integration of Caddo schools came to be known as the crossover. Now, this integration of schools in Caddo Parish, which was court ordered, don't forget, it took place in January of 1970. And this was a very difficult time, not only in the country, but specifically here in Caddo. It was difficult for administrators, for teachers, but most certainly difficult for students. Now, this crossover began in January as the students came back for the spring semester with the shifting of administrators and faculty members, including athletic coaching staffs. White assistant principals, coaches, classroom teachers, and ultimately clerical and custodial personnel were sent to all black schools. Black assistant principals, coaches, classroom teachers, and ultimately clerical and custodial personnel were sent to all white schools. Longtime administrative teams at schools like J.S. Clark and other just legendary schools, those teams and academic departments were broken up. Even coaching staffs were split. No one was happy. The ones that were sent to the other schools didn't want to be there, and then the people who were remaining at the schools didn't want the new people coming in. It was a mess. It's been said that no other event outside of the Civil War has had more of an impact on shaping Shreveport as we know it today than the forced integration of Caddo Parish Public Schools known as the crossover. And that was only the preliminary steps in January of 1970. Beginning with the next school year in fall of 1970, black students began their migration. Previous all-black high schools in Shreveport, which were centers of black scholastic and athletic culture and pride. Schools such as Union High School, Valencia High School, Eden Gardens, and Walnut Hill. Those schools were closed. Those black students were forced to migrate from their neighborhoods and to integrate into the city's previous all-white schools. Schools such as Woodlawn and Southwood, and Captain Shreve and Byrd and Fair Park and Northwood. Only 3 of the parish's all-black high schools, Booker T. Washington, Bethune, and Lanier High School, remained open. Now here's the question before I end this talk. Here's the question. Now I want you to think about this. Do you think that the schools in Caddo Parish today are more or less racially segregated than they were before this crossover, this forced migration? Okay. Pastor, I'm not going to hold class. I told you I'm not at my day job, but just think about that. If Shreveport, and I do know the answer, but I'll tell you this, if Shreveport is anything like national trends, the answer would be no. We have not made any improvements. We are just as segregated, if not even more segregated than we were in 1968. And I'll be releasing some of that work. Deacon Thomas, hold your hand up again. Deacon Thomas is responsible for a lot of this talk. He's a retired Caddo Parish high school supervisor, former assistant principal and administrator in this parish. And since he's retired, all those questions he wanted to research but didn't have time to do, he's making me do it. So with his help and guidance, we're going to bring some change by asking some good questions. Amen. But as you consider that question, I want to end my talk this morning by telling you about one of Caddo's many great educators. And this particular educator was known by the name of Coach Clifford Pennywell. Now, when this crossover in Caddo Parish hit, which again was the migration of black students from their neighborhood schools into the schools of their white counterparts in those white students' neighborhoods, head coaches in football and basketball remained intact wherever possible. But the men who had been head coaches at the all-black schools that closed were forced to move and change schools. Now, most of them went to assistant coaching or assistant head coach positions with the promise of getting first shots at the first open head coaching position that was available. Which brings me to the story of Coach Clifford Pennywell, who of all the coaches who were forced to move might have gotten a worse deal for one major reason. Coach Pennywell was Robert Parrish's first high school basketball coach, but he was not his last. See, in Robert Parrish's freshman and sophomore years, he was still a little raw fundamentally, but he was already 7 feet tall, and he was the center of that basketball squad. And he led Union High School, who was coached by Coach Pennywell, to the state semifinals of the black high school leagues that year. But when the crossover went into effect, and Robert Parrish and the rest of the Union High School students were sent to the all-white schools, most of them sent to nearby Woodlawn, Coach Pennywell did not make the migrationary trip with them. See, Woodlawn already had a good basketball coach. Ken Ivey was his name. And Coach Ivey had taken his 1968 and 69 team to the Class 3A state championship. Coach Pennywell, meanwhile, was able to continue as a head coach. And when this happened when there became an opening at Booker T. Washington. He was also the athletic director there. Many of you know this great man, this great educator. And for the next decade after that, BTW became one of the strongest powerhouses of high school basketball. But the question I have is, what if Coach Pennywell had coached Robert Parrish all 4 years? What if Union High School had not closed? If the crossover was the plan to ensure better educational outcomes for black school children of Caddo Parish, what's our plan now in 2019 to ensure that all black school children experience the best that Caddo Parish has to offer? Now, you've heard me this morning be critical of past plans, but what's the current one? What plan are we holding our leaders to be accountable to? Finally, there's another black migration happening right now. And it's the reverse of the first one that we discussed this morning. You see, there's a national trend happening whereas black families are moving out of the northern and midwestern cities and migrating back down to the homes of their ancestors and forefathers. They're leaving Detroit and Chicago, and they're migrating back to southern cities like Charlotte and Fort Lauderdale. They're leaving New York and Philadelphia and coming back to Austin and Atlanta. They're trading San Francisco for Savannah and leaving Newark to come back to New Orleans. And what happens when the sons and daughters of those who migrated from Shreveport begin to migrate back home? What will they find in 50, 60 years? What kind of schools will we have upheld for their children? Yes, this theme of black migration is interesting, and it's important, and it's happening as we speak. I'll leave you with this final question to consider. African Americans have been on the move for 400 years. We've migrated on a hope and a prayer, always in the belief that there was a better possible life for our children. 400 years from now, when we can document being in this country for 800 years, what will our migratory pattern look like? In 2419, I know we will still have the drive to make a better life for future generations of African Americans. I just hope that we will have done more work on making things better where we are. I hope we still won't be chasing the warmth of other suns. Thank you, everybody.
If you don't have to, for some other engagement, need to leave, be patient with us. Give us your attention for just a few minutes, and we'll do only what's necessary and then have us on our way to what's next. At this time, first thing we need to do is just take a minute to recognize some of what we have heard, if not all of it, and to acknowledge Dr. Hicks for sharing with us on such a high order, most informative, most enlightening was the collection of facts and information that he shared with us. And I want you to receive him and his message by saying amen. Amen. Give him another round of applause. I want to yield the floor now to my co-laborer and partner pastor, Bruce Carroll, to come. He'll make special acknowledgments and presentations to Dr. Hicks. Receive Pastor Carroll by saying amen.
Amen, amen. Come on, Pastor Jones, and open the doors of church for us, and then we'll do our remarks.
Good morning. Good morning. I feel like the Black History Talk was about me. Because all of that in Caddo Parish he talked about, that was me.
All right.
Going through all those changes, the crossover. I was the coach that was shipped out to Southwood from J.S. Clark that was giving players to Pennywell. So we were winning too much. So they took me from the black community and sent me out to the white community. This morning there might be somebody else been taken from somewhere in your life. And let me tell you, it doesn't matter where they take you. But if God is with you, he will keep you. And this time the doors of the church are open. Just like the way of God is always open for us. And if you're here and you really don't know where you're going, the structure of your life has been dismantled and mutilated. Your pattern of knowing where you are and where you're going, you really don't have it down pat. This is your time to lean on the everlasting arm. Just take him by the hand. He'll walk with you. He'll talk with you. He'll be your guide. If you're here right now, would you come now? Don't put it off. There are some of us, we thought we knew so much to find out that we didn't know anything. Would you come now? God is waiting. He wants an intimate relationship with you. You don't want to just shake your hand. He got his arms wide open. The invitation is still here. He extended it over 2,000 years ago. And this morning, this day, is still open. We've done as the Lord have asked, and yet there's still room for many, many more. Thank you, Pastor.
If you're happy, you know it, say amen. If you're happy, you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy, you know it, say amen. Come on, now let's give the Lord a hand clap of praise on today. Amen. We are delighted to be in the house of the Lord one more time. Listen, all I can say after hearing Dr. Hicks is wow. I was following him and trying to keep up with him. He threw me off when he said, I called and said, to stand in the gap. I got something for that in a few minutes. But to follow him and to see where he was going and connect those dots on today. We have in both the Antioch Church and the Shady Grove Church, people who are in tune with what's going on in our educational situation in this parish. and some of the issues that have taken place. I am, as some of my cousins say, you left here, you migrated, but you came back. And I'm back, and I'm learning the pattern. I'm learning the paths, and the names and things are being said. I'm learning the culture and the history, and I'm just delighted to be a part of the fabric in both these churches who are concerned about the educational plight of our young people. Our children have done well. Come on, let's give them another hand. I often say that they're young now. You may not think they're in tune to what's going on. You may not think they're listening while they're texting and they got their phones and some of them are asleep, but they're gonna wake up one morning. They're gonna wake up, y'all, and their intuitive minds, they're gonna be able to start asking questions. Mama, what does that mean? Grandmama, what does that mean? What was that y'all were talking about? Then you got a chance to tell them about the Lord, amen? And and about the things that are going on in our community, and even with the idea of black migration, we be able to tell them stories. So we are teaching them things right now they may not quite understand. Brother, nullification. There you go. I was telling him, I said, hey, Doc, we helped him, and he said that word, and he said nullification, came right that door, said nullification, came straight here, and still, but it's okay, because he's going to do it again. He get an opportunity to repeat that speech again. Amen? All right. So you get that nullification come down. So it's a training process, it's a learning process for each and every. How many times I mess up words? Amen. But listen, today I want to come, Dr. Hicks, I want to present you with this plaque just to say thank you. I don't know about all that stuff in terms of we can't pay you. We're going to certainly do our best. Amen. Amen. But I met Dr. Hicks several years ago just in passing, and kept him on my mind and heart, and I would see him in places and watch him move about, and I knew he was a part of an educational endeavor, just trying to help our black boys, just help our children all together. Several years ago, and I knew his name, had never really just spending time talking to him, and so a couple of weeks ago, Missionary College was at the Antioch Church. And there were some professors there and some students there just touring our facility. In walks Dr. Hicks. I say, wow. And so we began to collaborate and began to talk. And to be honest, he was on my mind because our mayor had not given me an answer at that time. He had not given us an answer at that time. And so I was trying to get him, and as I said in my mind and heart, I wanted to get him to speak, Dr. Hicks to come and speak to us. So of course, when we had put out that the mayor had given the answer and we had put everything on Facebook, my first response was, because of social media, I thought he knew. Y'all, come on with me, man. We thought that he knew. I thought that he knew that the mayor, so I said, I'm gonna need you to stand in the gap for your fraternity brother. My God.
Hold on, Pastor. It's not the pulpit, so I can interrupt you. Don't step on my story. You said I want you to stand in the gap.
That's right.
That's the story I'm sticking to.
And he has become, we've talked, he has certainly enlightened us on today. It was all God. I just want to believe that, and I pray that y'all believe that it was all God, and God knew that he would be here on today to share with us. Amen. Amen. Come on, give it up. We're going to present Dr. R. Hicks, our speaker theme, Black Migrations, our combined Black worship service, Black History worship service, Antioch Baptist Church, Bruce C. Carroll, Senior Pastor, Shady Baptist Church, Al Golden Sudds Sr. Pastor, Shreveport, Louisiana, February 24th, 2019. All right. I see here, our kids are going to sing. Our kids are going to sing a time of praise. So come on, young people, come on, and as they are giving, as they are coming, as they are preparing to sing, as you're preparing to worship, our next will be a time to give. So prepare your hearts and minds. I do believe that Antioch has some envelopes. I want to make sure that Antioch gets your envelopes. We'll have a separate basket for the Antioch church, and then a basket for the tithes and offering for the Shady Grove church. Amen? Amen? Amen. All right, come on, say amen as our children come. Amen.